Why is that so hard for us to realize? Why do we have to make social services so punitive here in the US?
I'm a real believer in universal programs. When we were talking about earlier off ramps for the wealthiest Americans, universal programs, especially when you combine them with an actually progressive tax system, and we have a long way to go to make our tax system more progressive to get the wealthiest Americans to pay their fair share, corporations to pay their fair share. But generally, universal programs are just better, not just because they're more equitable, they're also less wasteful. And they create the sense of social solidarity. Like everyone has to use the NHS here in the UK. Everyone gets paid parental leave if they have a kid. And there's a myth in the US that we don't pay as much tax. So that's why we don't get these things. And it's just not true. Matt Brunig had a really great piece in Jacobin a few years ago where he talks about how if you take into consideration health insurance payments, because of the Affordable Care Act making them mandatory as part of like the labor tax rate. So, in places like the UK, because healthcare is funded by general taxation, it's already included in your labor tax rate. So he recalculated using the health insurance premiums, and he found that in the US, we pay one of the highest labor tax rates in the OECD. So Norway, where you have these, you have universal healthcare as well, you have all of these great family-friendly policies, they pay like 32% labor tax rate, whereas in the US, we're paying 43%. So a lot of money is just being wasted. It's going into lining private pockets. And a huge amount of that is going on healthcare. 27% of household spending, I think, was the most recent stat on that, goes on healthcare alone. The other big chunk of money goes on housing. And so all of these things combined make it so that in the US, it's not really affordable to have like a dignified life in the way that it is in other countries. And it's not because we're not paying enough tax. We are.
Does that keep you from wanting to return?
That's
that
a
too
hard
personal?
question because my family's there. My family's in Los Angeles, or a lot of my family's in Los Angeles. My mom's there, my dad's there. I think if I go home, it would be to be closer to them. I'm Mexican Iranian, and both of my cultures are very family oriented, and I'm starting to feel like all of these years away, it's tough. I'm not going back tomorrow, but I am going back soon for a book tour, but not to live.
And the worst Mexican food I've ever had is in England. I had nachos in Bath, and that was the dumbest thing I could have ever done in my life.
I always tell people here that if we're going to a Mexican restaurant, I have to treat it like it's another place. Like it's not Mexican food. This is like another type of food.
Just go to Nando's. Just go to Nando's.
Nando's.
Just go to Nando's, and don't try, because I'm a we played a show, and it was after the show we were somewhere, like some like pub or something, and I saw nachos on the menu. Like, we'll get nachos, right? It's like whatever. You get Mexican food after the show. There's always taco truck open in the bay. No, I learned about kebabs.
Kebabs are good.
The chippy,
The
Scotland.
chippy, yeah.
Yeah, I learned
Fish and
about that.
chips.
Right? You do that. A munchie box, as they call it out there. You get that, and after the show, you're good. Don't try to, whatever you left at home, you leave there. And do not.
I'm lucky. I live in London, and the food's gotten a lot better in London. But this is embarrassing. But when I go home to LA and I eat an avocado again for the first time in over a year, I kind of tear up just because it's just,
you probably cry.
Another thing, like a completely different species.
Very, very, very true. I do want to talk a little bit about housing. As you brought up, you're from Los Angeles. I am from the Bay Area. Two places that have ridiculously large homeless populations. I actually, before I came down here to Mexico, worked with the unhoused in Oakland, California. So I definitely understand how much we spend on homelessness just in California, and I know why and how it doesn't work. Reading about Singapore was kind of like, what? Nearly universal public housing has almost eradicated homelessness. How might these policies translate to the US? Not even so much for just trying to solve homelessness. A big part of that is people not being able to afford to live. So you have to take on a roommate in the US. Um, it's a little different in Singapore. Can you explain their universal housing system a little bit?
Singapore is a really interesting example in the book because it's so different. Like the context there is so different from other countries that I looked at. So like it's so different from Norway, which is a social democracy. It's a kind of hyper capitalist country in which everything is very pick yourself up by your own bootstraps, to the point where things that we would consider even in the US like a given from government, like public school, there's no such thing really as public school in Singapore. You have to like pay fees to go to school. And yet the one thing they decided to do when they became a sovereign country was housing. And it kind of developed over the years, but they had this idea of public housing for all. And basically since like the 1970s, it's developed that they started building high quality apartment buildings, in which at some point they realized, hey, all of our citizens have these like mandatory pension savings accounts that they can't touch until they're, of retirement age, and they have employer contributions to them, and that money's just kind of sitting there. We could encourage them to use some of that to buy their own public housing apartment, and that just unlocked this really wild experiment that's worked out really well for them, where now 90% of Singaporeans are homeowners and 80% of them live in public housing. I met a lot of Singaporeans when I was there who could afford to live in one of these like fancy condos that foreigners live in. But they were just like, we have a great apartment. It's affordable, it's well built, it's high quality. There's no stigma attached to living in public housing because everyone lives in public housing. Why would we spend more on something that's comparable? And so I was just blown away by how they not just took away the stigma from public housing, but like how they built housing that people could be really proud of and happy to live in. I met this retired preschool teacher who lived in one of the new towns that they kind of designed in the 1980s, 90s when this was all taking off, called Yishun. And she Chuhar was her name, and she had a 3-bedroom apartment. She had two small children, and she moved in there with her husband, and they could afford to have an apartment that size. And she actually became a widow pretty soon after they first bought their home. And even despite the change in her financial circumstances, even despite having to be a single mom, she was able to pay her house off years ago. And it wasn't even a question. I mean, that's one of the really amazing things, that even though a lot of people won't say it this way, housing is essentially a right in Singapore.
When you go back to the United States and people ask you, "Oh, how you been? What you been working on?" And you tell them about this, I'm sure you were just chatty Cathy with everybody talking about where you've been. Because there's a lot of stamps on your passport for writing this book. Um, do people look at you like, "What in the year 3000 bullshit are you talking, Natasha? There's no good public housing in Singapore. What do you mean people like their government housing?" What is the response you get when you say that to people in the States?
It used to feel like if I had these conversations, even before I wrote this book, like, they have universal healthcare. And oh yeah, but that's there and this is here. And I don't know, we can't have that. It always felt like there was some excuse where like the US is just, the very typical excuse, like it's too diverse and too populated here. We can't, how would we ever do that? And really think that these are disingenuous excuses. Like our diversity, I come from an immigrant family. I think our diversity is a strength. I want to see it as a kind of asset. And I started to reframe the question of like, why is it that, one of the countries I went to, tiny Uruguay, why is it that Uruguay, with so much less money than we have, with so much less like human resources, so we're going to talk about like, oh, we're really populated. Yeah, these are like, we have great people in the States. Why can these other countries do things that we can't do? And it does kind of start to chip away at that argument. Like I really I'm hopeful because of a lot of reasons, even now in the States. But one of the really cool things was that when it comes to Singapore's public housing, for example, there are a few political leaders in the States that are actually modeling policies that they're trying to get passed in Hawaii and California. They're modeling them on Singapore's public housing. So these ideas are out there. They're starting to be applied to a US context. And I'm not the only one talking about them, which is exciting.